in this context, I'm using literary historiography to mean not just the study of literature, but the study of how literature has been studied. So, for example, one could talk about the literary historiography of monstrosity, and include everything from medieval bestiaries to Dracula, but also to examine how these texts have been linked with each other and made to speak to each other within the history of literary criticism. So when I talk about literary historiography, I'm not just talking about what primary literary sources can tell us, but about what the different readings and interpretations of those sources can also tell us. And I do think it's important to talk about historiography rather than history in this context, because we don't ever receive texts on a direct line from the past, but rather we receive them alongside what can sometimes be centuries worth of analysis and interpretation, or at least we do within, literary studies. So I suppose the obvious question is, how can we talk about genderqueer literary historiography when the term genderqueer is itself a very recent product of our current historical and cultural moment? It's a word that's only appeared in the past decade or two and is in that sense thoroughly modern. But I'm introducing the idea of a genderqueer literary historiography in a context where this practice already exists for various groups who are marginalised along the axes of gender and sexuality. Queer historiography, and to a lesser extent trans historiography, are established reading practices which go back to all the texts with a view towards uncovering our past and in some way legitimising the existence of contemporary gendered and sexual minorities. So, for example, we have David Clarke's Between Medieval Men, Male Friendship and Desire in Early Medieval English Literature, and the anthology Same-Sex Love and Desire Among Women in the Middle Ages. We have Valerie Traub's The Renaissance of Lesbianism in Early Modern England, and Jonathan Goldberg's wonderfully titled Sodometries, Renaissance Texts, Modern Sexualities, looking at the period in around the 16th century. In the 19th century, we have things like Eve Sedgwick's classic text, Between Men, English Literature and Male Homosocial Desire, and so on and so on. And more recently, we have Jay Prosser, whose fantastic book, Second Skins, The Bawdy Narratives of Transsexuality, was probably the first major intervention in terms of bringing trans historiography into the realm of academia. And in all these cases, it's a project obviously informed by contemporary understandings of gender and sexuality. But perhaps paradoxically, what these studies illustrate is that gay, lesbian, and trans are all ultimately just as much products of our current historical moment as genderqueer is, that these ways of categorizing identities haven't always existed, and that models of gender and sexuality have been very different in the past. So, while these historiographical projects are obviously on one level very much about revealing and narrativizing a history for modern gendered and sexual minorities to connect to, they also demonstrate how very contingent these modern identities are. And so what's happening isn't so much a search for, say, gay identity as we understand it today, but a search for the underlying fact, as it were, of gay identity, which would be same-sex desire. And in the case of lesbian and gay historiography, and for gender dysphoria in the case of trans historiography. I just realised I left my bottle of water down there. Kat, could you chuck it at me, please? Or not chuck, but gently pass so we don't get the electrics. Oh, is the mic going wrong? Is everything okay? Oh, it's slanted. How do I put everything down? Right. So this is a principle, the search of the sort of underlying fact, that we can translate to genderqueer historiography. The sociologists Dave Ekins and Richard King identify 4 different modes of being trans: migration, negation, oscillation, and transcension. And of these, negation, oscillation, and transcension can all be somewhat encompassed under the term genderqueer, when used in its loosest possible sense, as an umbrella term for genders which are other than uncomplicatedly male or female. So once we start thinking not of the modern, historically contingent identity genderqueer itself, but of ways of living and being which can be described using these ideas of negation, oscillation, or transcension, then hopefully the idea of doing genderqueer historiography begins to make more sense. And even though the modern identity genderqueer isn't itself legible in literary history, there is an absolute wealth of material to do with troubling the boundaries of gender. Representations of androgyny, of cross-dressing, representations which have previously been read as expressive of queer sexuality rather than transgender, anywhere where there's evidence of a sort of gendered liminality, these are all places where we can begin to track genderqueer in literature. And I've worked on various literary representations of gendered liminality, including multi-layered cross-dressing on the English Renaissance stage, and what one might today term trans-masculinity in 19th century literature. But today I'm going to be focusing on Virginia Woolf's model of androgyny put forward in A Room of One's Own and Orlando. So Woolf passed as male on at least one occasion during the Dreadnought hoax, which I would give you a picture of, but I didn't make a PowerPoint. And in 1928 she produced 2 meditations on the idea of androgyny. A Room of One's Own, which has both been enthusiastically claimed and heartily disavowed by feminist readers, and Orlando, which has been, on the one hand, dismissed as tedious high camp, and more recently seen as an important perspective on sort of Butlerian ideas of gender performativity. And I consider it very important to think of these texts as working in concert with each other. A Room of One's Own is where Woolf theorises androgyny. In fact, it's almost a manifesto for androgyny. And Orlando is where this androgynous vision is not simply theorised, but embodied and displayed and enacted. So in simple terms, if Room is theory, then Orlando is practice. In Room, Woolf advocates for the financial and social independence of women in the particular context of literary production. Woolf argues that only when women are freed from the particular disadvantages of their social status as women, that will they be able to produce great literature. She proposes that the ideal creative mind is an androgynous one, and gives the example of Shakespeare. In the 1970s, Elaine Showalter criticised this as Woolf beating a timid retreat from the painful reality of her own femininity. She also calls this androgynous ideal passive and inhuman. And I have opinions about Elaine Showalter, but I'm going to mostly save them. But in the 60s, Carolyn Halebrun described this sort of androgyny as the only way of being a fully human subject. So there's certainly something of a split about this, even in early feminist criticism of A Room of One's Own. And the tension between these two critical readings of androgyny is either inhuman or the only way of being fully human is very interesting, as both sort of attempt to circumscribe the boundaries of personhood through gender. And I think it's really interesting to bring that into dialogue with what Butler talks about in Undoing Gender in terms of gender being a process by which people are granted or denied humanity. But there isn't time to go into that in detail, so ask me about it afterwards if you like. In Orlando, Woolf describes the life of someone who is born a nobleman in the Elizabethan era and lives through several centuries while aging about 15 years. During the reign of King Charles, Orlando undergoes a mysterious transformation and becomes physically a woman, as the text describes it. Although J. Prosser sees Orlando as a commentary on the cultural vicissitudes of gender, rather than being about transgender in any meaningful sense, I have to disagree. I contend that both Orlando and A Room of One's Own are not only deeply queer texts, but texts which actively anticipate the sort of gender pluralism that today is encompassed by the genderqueer umbrella. In Room, Woolf posits androgyny as the solution to the sexual polarization that inhibits artistic expression. Both manly and womanly writing is depicted as artificial and aesthetically lacking, and coming from states of mind which are maintained only through the effort of repression. In contrast to these gendered states, Woolf sees the creative androgynous mind as one, and I quote, in which one could continue without effort because nothing is required to be held back. Yet this androgynous ideal is emphatically not a monolithic gendered construct. Woolf's idea of androgyny was decidedly pluralistic. Even in the ostensibly... Oh God, give me a second. Even in the ostensibly prescriptive phrase, one must be woman-manly or man-womanly, this phrase actually gestures towards the potential diversity within androgynous gender expression, with different degrees and inflections of womanliness and manliness. And I think Woolf very strikingly shows her distrust of gendered homogeneity in the following quotation, which is long, but it's worth it because it's fabulous. "It would be 1,000 pities if women wrote like men, or lived like men, or looked like men. For if two sexes are quite inadequate, considering the vastness and variety of the world, how should we manage with one only? Ought not education to bring out and fortify the differences rather than the similarities? For we have too much likeness as it is, and if an explorer should come back and bring word of other sexes looking through the branches of other trees at other skies, nothing would be of greater service to humanity." And so we see that Woolf's androgynous vision is replete with pluralistic, genderqueer possibility. And while admittedly it is framed with the binary terms of manly and womanly, the problem is with the language available rather than the underlying idea. And we encounter this binaristic language even today, even in queer and transgender writing that explicitly seeks to deconstruct this binary. We can't easily escape the terms of the language that we're using. In Orlando, Woolf simultaneously invokes gender essentialism and gender as a social construct, juxtaposing these conflicting models and allowing them to feed into one another. Woolf states that, on the one hand, men's clothes and women's clothes force them into performing certain roles, whereas if they dressed alike, they might relate to the world in the same way, a woman holding a sword rather than keeping her skirts sort of from falling all over the place might have a different stance and thus a different perspective. There's quite a long paragraph about it. But then on the other hand, she says that clothes are but a symbol of something hid deep beneath. She then goes on to problematize this further, writing, "In every human being, a vacillation from one sex to the other takes place, and often it is only the clothes that keep the male or female likeness, while underneath, the sex is the very opposite of what it is above." So she's putting all these conflicting ideas in at the same time, and it's this real sort of multiplicity of voices even within her own authorial voice, and I think that's really interesting. And Orlando's bodily change to ostensible female is a reification of this change from one sex to the other that Woolf argues takes place in all human beings. Yet this change in fact serves to open up a range of gendered possibilities and gendered expressions, rather than to trap Orlando in just one, and to also open up their sexuality. Woolf writes that Orlando changed far more frequently than those who have worn only one set of clothing can conceive, and enjoyed the love of both sexes equally. So there's some bi-visibility for you, hooray. Sketching Orlando's typical day, Woolf describes how they wear a china robe of ambiguous gender for receiving visitors in the morning, knee breeches for gardening, a flowered taffeta dress for receiving a proposal of marriage, a snuff-coloured gown like a lawyer's when they go to court, and finally the clothes of a nobleman to walk the streets in search of adventure. All in one day, God, I'm jealous. In these we see Orlando occupying genderlessness, maleness, femaleness, otherness. Ellen Carroll Jones has contended that as woman is defined by the absence of a stable position, writing that thus Orlando is a woman precisely because she changes sex. Yet, in the context of genderqueer existence, then this model is clearly insufficient. Not every non-man is a woman. Orlando goes through femininity into a kind of androgynous plasticity. Like a fictional Kate Bornstein, physical transition is only the beginning of a gendered experience of self that goes far beyond the male-female binary. In Undoing Gender, Judith Butler writes, "It is not merely a question of producing a new future for genders that do not yet exist. The genders I have in mind have been existing for a long time, but they have not been admitted into the terms that govern reality. It is a question of developing a new legitimating lexicon for the gender complexity that we have always been living. If Orlando and Room evince this gender complexity that we have always been living, then genderqueer vocabulary, as we develop it today, is surely this new legitimating lexicon that gives us new ways of reading and understanding Woolf's androgynous vision. And this leads me to the point I'd like to leave you with, genderqueer historiography as radical reading practice. I've only been able to look at one example in any kind of detail today, but what I'd really like you to take away from this is the idea that gender liminality does exist everywhere in the literature that we've inherited. There have always been modes of resistance against dyadic gender constructs, no matter what those constructs are. And I wish I had time to talk about the 16th century and the 19th century because it's bloody fascinating. And I went off book and now I can't work out where I am. I want to propose genderqueer historiography as a way of re-inflecting queer and feminist reading practices, so that we don't think purely in terms of how man and woman meant different things in different eras, but also actively seek out the space between those terms, with a project of exposing the fictionality of the whole system, both then and now. Genderqueer is simply one of the newest ways of describing this gender complexity that we have always been living. Thank you.